Hello students, this is Professor McDonald, and this will be the narrated PowerPoint slideshow for Chapter 6 for Intro to Terrorism Studies. Next slide. Again, Chapter 6, Terrorism by Dissidents. Terrorism by Dissidents. Chapter objectives. What is dissident terrorism? We'll take a look at the Department of State and their requirements for listing organizations on the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. That responsibility, again, lies with the Department of State and the Secretary of State. Critically examine and discuss the differences between the primary dissident terrorism environments. You have the revolutionary, the nihilist, the nationalist. We've got some others that we'll talk about as well. What impact does religion play in communal terrorist activity? We'll talk about the importance of symbolism to terrorists and describe the weapons that they use to carry out their targets. To carry out their violence. Next slide. Again, we're talking about a dissident terrorism paradigm. Terrorism from below, committed by non-state movements and groups against governments, ethno-nationalist groups, religious groups, and other perceived enemies. When we mean by non-state, in other words, they are not like the last chapter where we were talking about countries like Iran that use the powers of the state or the government to support, either in a patronage or assistance model, terrorist activity. Here we're talking about groups that do not have the power of the state. They're below state, and that's why they're called dissident terrorism organizations. Next slide. Let's look at some of our different perspectives. I also like to use different models. We have revolutionary dissident terrorism. They have a clear world vision, engage in action to cause complete revolutionary change. They look at the existing order of the environment where they exist as corrupt and oppressive. They wish to build a new society on the remains of the old system. Normally, your revolutionary dissidents do not have the power. They're outgunned. Another way to describe it, they'd be outgunned when compared to the state. As a result, since they can't go head-to-head with the state, they have to use unconventional methods of war to accomplish their goals. And this includes terrorism. And again, let's talk about some of the revolutionary types. The Marxist class of society with centralized, if you look at the Marxists, they wanted a class of society with centralized economic planning, so those left-wing revolutionaries would fall into that category. You have your Islamic revolutionaries like Hezbollah, based out of Lebanon. They're looking for a culturally pure society of Lebanon, and what does that mean? It would be Muslim. There would not be other religious elements. It would be run by Sharia law, so you'll get away with your secular government, your non-religious government. And a group like Hezbollah is very political and very well armed. Your nihilist, and this originates in Russia during the 19th century, started as a lot of time, in many of these movements, they started with students, probably students of your age, college students. And they felt that the world was ignorant and only scientific truth would end the ignorance. And therefore they needed the destruction of a society that was based, its foundation was religion, the structure of the family, nationalism. These were the roots of evil that must be destroyed. And so their vision didn't exist. To the nihilist, their goal is to destroy the existing system, and whatever emerges, emerges, and the victory is in the destruction, not the rebuilding of a society. They leave that to others. Examples, the Red Brigades in Italy, the Weather Underground here in the United States, and again, to accomplish their goals, they engage in terrorist violence. Your nationalist dissidents, they exist to champion a people where they feel their interests are subordinate to a government or another group, and so therefore they have more of a nationalist common sentiment. Perhaps they wish some degree of national autonomy. If you look at the Kurds in the Middle East, there are Kurdish populations in Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria, all within an area. What they would love to see is a Kurdish nation where they would have national autonomy. If you look at the Provisional Irish Republican Army, of course, their goals were to bring the power, reunite Northern Ireland with Southern Ireland, and to eliminate the British rule. So these are examples of these. Next slide. And there's a picture of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. They led the Cuban Revolution, which was a left-wing revolution. They adopted communism later after the revolution had actually ended. And as it turned out, Cuba was their only success story. Guevara tried to go into South America, in particular Bolivia, and his ideas were not welcomed by the population. He was eventually killed by state troops. The revolutionary dissident, again, a clear world vision, all the things that I just talked about. Build a new society based on religion or ideology, whatever it might be. And again, we had the Marxist revolutionary movements in Latin America, and of course groups like the Hezbollah and the Muslim Brotherhood, who wish to replace secular government with Sharia law or God's law. Next slide. The nihilists that I've talked about, revolution for the sake of revolution. Their goal is to destroy the order with armed conflict, no alternative for the aftermath. An example would be the Weathermen Underground, who operated in the United States. There's a picture of Bernardine Dohrn, who was active with that terrorist organization. Next slide. Or another bullet, excuse me. Other examples, the Red Brigade, Al-Qaeda network. This is a picture of the Provisional Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland with the traditional Irish flag behind the terrorist. Again, nationalist dissident terrorism champion the national aspirations of their group, and I've already discussed what's in this slide. Next slide. Another interesting discussion that occurs in this textbook is about child warriors. And this is the use of children as warriors within the organizations themselves. And as distasteful as that sounds, it is a very popular method of recruitment in many parts of the world. The United Nations considers any person under the age of 18 as a child relative to being classified as a child warrior. Globally, there's about 300,000 children, some as age as young as 6, who have been conscripted to support these groups. And I've listed some of them in the bottom. Charles Taylor and the Small Boy Unit out of Liberia, the Tamil Tigers out of Sri Lanka, and right-wing pro-government and left-wing guerrillas in Colombia. Another one I'll mention is the Lord's Resistance Army, which is also out of the African continent. Many times they'll kidnap these children from their villages in Africa, force them to do terrible things like murder their family, whatever. They become dependent on the group. And this doesn't just mean boys. They use the girls as sex slaves, as cooks, to carry their gear as they move from place to place. Next slide. Again, the practice of dissident terrorism, intensities of conflict, an anti-state environment, anti-state, anti-government. To the terrorists, defeat is unthinkable. In other words, they have a total faith in victory, whether it be God's will or whatever. And we're also going to talk about communal terrorism, which is group conflicts within a nation. Next slide. Another concept is, obviously, when we have these below-state groups, they don't have the power of the state, whether it be weaponry or even the methods and training, so they use unconventional, unexpected, and nearly unpredictable methods of political violence. And that's why they engage in asymmetrical conflict, because they're quantitatively and qualitatively weaker than the security forces. So they use asymmetrical conflict, and this could be almost like hit-and-run techniques. They blend in with the population. We see this in Iraq. We see it in Afghanistan and other parts of the world. They try to deliver maximum propaganda and symbolic blows against a strong enemy. Ultimately, if they can make the state look weak, they can try to win over the people. And if once they get the people's support, then there's a chance for a revolution. So these asymmetrical methods have been successful, and they continue to use them, and it's a real challenge for law enforcement and the military as they address this method of warfare. We also talk about net war, which is a new organizational theory where you have, when you look at the terrorist organizations today, many of them are loosely confederated networks of semi-autonomous cells. And what that means is you might have 8 people here in this city, and then 4 countries over you might have 6 people that form a cell. Perhaps they're like-minded in their ideology, but they operate essentially alone. That doesn't mean they don't have contact with other cells, but and many times they don't even know who the members of these other cells are, and that works to their advantage because of the operational security. If a cell gets captured, some members get captured, they really, under interrogation, they can't tell who their colleagues are in the other cells. And they're normally, and they use, with this new, with the internet and the technological tools that are available today, cyber and digital technologies, they can communicate, they can train, they can recruit, they can seek financing, and this theory calls it net war. In a sense, they use the tools of technology to further their causes. And also operationally, a terrorist could be sitting in Pakistan directing a terrorist attack in India as he talks on the cell phone or even over the internet with the individuals that are involved and provide instructions. And this has happened in particular in the Mumbai attack. Again, don't forget the martyr nation as an asymmetrical strategy. Next slide. Again, war against the state, destabilize the existing government and build a new order. And they can be one or more of a combination, like we've talked about. This is kind of a review slide. Revolutionary, nihilist, nationalist. You could also have criminal terrorists that are profit-driven. We see this in Mexico with the cartels. Their murder of innocent civilians, their murder of using violence against law enforcement and the judiciary, against politicians or whatever, anybody that would have any impact on their ability to sell their drugs or whatever their goods are, run their weapons, they will kill them and they will track them down. And that becomes, in a sense, criminal terrorism, in the sense that their real motive is not ideology. They don't want to create a new state. They want to make money. Other groups, the Red Army faction, there's a picture of some of their members. That was a left-wing terrorist organization that operated in the former West Germany. This is during the Soviet times. And I've already talked about the Provisional IRA. The ETA is out of Spain. Next slide. Communal terrorism. That's group against group terrorism. And there you see a picture of a victim of communal terrorism in Africa. Communal terrorism can actually, and it involves ethno-national, racial, religious undertones and themes, conflict between population. Terrorists say they see their group identity perhaps as being vulnerable, so they lash out against other groups who they feel are a threat to their existence, and this justifies their violence. This type of terrorism can result in extreme repression and even evolve into genocide, and we've seen that in the last 20 years with Rwanda, with Darfur, and even if you go a little bit longer than 20 years ago, the ethnic cleansing that occurred in places like the former Yugoslavia. Bosnia, you had the same problem. Many times what you had there would be the Bosnian Serbs, who were Orthodox Christians, engaged in ethnic cleansing, removing of a people from a territory, which would be the Muslims. And these people had coexisted under the Yugoslavian Soviet times, but there were deep-seated conflict that goes back centuries with these groups. And once the Soviet Union fell and these former Soviet republics started to gain their own autonomy, you did have some civil wars that occurred in these regions. And that's what happened. Kosovo was one that I can personally attest to. I went in there not long after the bombing, and I was myself and another agent. I was a postal inspector there on the international security team. We were, to the best of my knowledge, other than the State Department regional security officer who we worked with when we got there, we might have been the first federal agents that went in there. Our job was to conduct security audits and reviews of their postal and telecommunication systems. In some countries, the post office is not just selling stamps and shipping packages. They also operate the communication industry, cell phones, etc., and many of them do the banking. So you could have a combination of a bank, the phone system, and also the mail, and that was the main communication facility throughout the country. So our job was to go in there when the Serbs had been driven out by the United Nations, and to do security audit reviews, interview people, try to set up standards to get these systems back in place. It was really a great opportunity for myself and another inspector who went in there. But when I was there, the point I'm trying to make is you had seen ethno-nationalist terrorism that had occurred. The Serbs had killed the Muslims. Most of Kosovo was Albanian Muslims who had immigrated into that part of Serbia from Albania. They called them ethnic Albanians. They had suffered under the Serb rule. Now the problem was, when I was there, was because there was a lot of retaliation going on, where the Muslims were, if they caught a Serb out on the street, they killed him. And so that was one of the challenges that law enforcement and the United Nations had at the times when I was there. But again, I saw some mass graves. I talked to individuals who had witnessed these type of atrocities. Next slide. And there's a picture of Rwanda, a perfect example of genocide. Ethno-national communal terrorism, again directed against ethnic populations. You can have different tribes like the Tutsis and the Hutus, whichever one is in power or whatever. They'll go out with machetes in these cases and destroy the other tribe. It might be a conflict that has simmered for centuries, and then it emerges all of a sudden. But they're very brutal. They engage in terrorist activity. Everybody is a target, from old people to very young babies. The Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda and Burundi. It's a perfect example. Next slide. Religious communal terrorism, and I've talked about that with the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, the Serb Christians versus the Bosnian Muslims. And then in our textbook, they also talk about ideological communal terrorism that occurred in places like Greece, Angola, and Indonesia. Next slide. Post 9/11 adaptation. After 9/11, with the passage of the Patriot Act, other legislations, the focus on improving intelligence, expanding our resources in law enforcement to combat the threat from Islamic religious terrorism. One of the things that we knew as a nation we had to do was cut off the money. And so you saw a new focus and new powers given to law enforcement to go after accounts, freeze assets of terrorists, go after charities where monies from charities perhaps were being funneled into the bank accounts of known terrorists. And so this was a real challenge for the United States, which we responded to very well. I always believe in follow the money. The money will take you back to the source of whether it's a donation or the terrorists themselves. And they have to have money to operate. So we saw the terrorists then responded. Many of them closed their bank accounts. They transferred their assets out of banks into something like valuable commodities, perhaps gold, diamonds, gems, real estate, cars, whatever. Something that couldn't be traced, something that couldn't be seized in a banking. And they also use Hawala, which is how can I put it? It's it's an alternative remittance system, a transnational system of brokers where there is no tracing of the monies. In other words, if I want to get money using Hawala, if I want to get money from the United States to Syria, I would go to Hawaladar here, give him the money, say $5,000 to transfer to a terrorist in Syria. I would give him the $5,000. He would give me a code. I would call the terrorist in Syria and say, here's the code number, and here's the person you need to see. Tomorrow that person would go to another Hawaladar in Syria, and he would turn over that $5,000. There's been no paperwork. There's no trail. That's why they can use this very effectively. And these two Hawaladars, they carry a balance sheet, and they'll make up the money at some point. So there's no wiring of money. It's a system built on trust. This section I talk about terrorist targets and weapons, the symbolism of targets. Terrorists select their targets because of their symbolic and propaganda value. It's pretty obvious because they want to appeal to their base, to their founders, to their financiers, to let them know that they are a viable organization. That's why, for example, you see a picture here of the U.S. Embassy bombing in Kenya. Most of the people killed in that bombing were Kenyans, not Americans. There were some killed. And I've been to Nairobi where this occurred, and at the time the American Embassy was right on the street, so it was a pretty easy target. We don't, when we build our embassies overseas now, we make them much more harder targets where they're built back and away with a lot of physical structures and improved technological security and manpower, etc. But again, the symbolism of America is why they would attack this. The 9/11 attacks, the Pentagon, the symbolism of the center of the country with the strongest military in the world. The World Trade Center represents capitalism and its impact on the world. So these are symbolic targets that terrorists look to hit and try to obtain as much propaganda value as they can. Again, typical targets: embassy and diplomatic personnel overseas, international symbols. An international symbol could be something that, let me think, I'm trying to think of a really good example of an international symbol. A military target, say for example, somebody that represents the U.S. Marine Corps, the U.S. Army. It could be companies. You could have a Microsoft, a BP, Shell Oil. These people represent multi-international corporations. The terrorists will try to spin it that these are people exploiting our country, and that's why we're attacking them. And passenger carry is very popular. Anything with transportation is very popular. Airliners, we've seen that with hijackings, and of course the 9/11 attack. Also, trains and buses are popular targets because you have a lot of victims in a close proximity that can be destroyed. Next slide. Weapons old and new. We have high-range weapons of mass destruction all the way down to low-range homemade weapons, and that could be your IED. Somebody puts together an IED, or somebody takes a fertilizer, combines it with fuel oil, and constructs a major bomb, something ammonium nitrate bomb, something that Tim McVeigh used in the Oklahoma City bombing. Firearms, you have explosives, obviously submachine guns, assault rifles, etc. Our common explosives are our plastic explosives. That's your RDX, your Semtex, your C4, military grade. And again, I've already mentioned the ammonium nitrate. Makes a powerful bomb, and that can be based on a foundation of fertilizer that would be obtained from a fertilizer company that provides those type of materials to farmers. These are all possible weaponry that can be used by terrorists in their violence. Next slide. If we look at continuation, what type of triggers do they use? They might have a time bomb. They might have fuses, pressure triggers. Somebody steps on something, it goes off, or you push down, you open something up, and it goes off. High technology triggers. We've seen barometric triggers, where if they put a bomb on an airplane, that's what happened with the Pan Am flight. Once it reaches 35,000 feet, then that would be the activator for the bomb itself, and it would explode. Types of bomb, gasoline bombs, kind of like a Molotov cocktail, where you take gasoline and glass or whatever and light it, throw it. Pipe bombs, there's a picture of a pipe bomb and its components. I dealt with pipe bombs when I was a U.S. Postal Inspector. I worked on multiple cases where people had mailed bombs to try to kill other people, sometimes successful, sometimes not. Normally it was a pipe bomb that they used. And of course we've seen the advent of the vehicular bomb, a vehicle that's loaded with explosives. Next slide. Old and new, our weapons of mass destruction, your biological agents, there's a listing of them. Anthrax, I can tell you as a postal inspector, that drove us crazy when those letters were sent out with anthrax that killed several postal employees and several other individuals. We had to partner up with the FBI and many military EOD teams in the big cities. They had their own explosive teams. And responding to the fear if people got any type of envelope that it looked like it had some kind of powder in it, they would be called as saying they thought they had an anthrax letter. So it was, and this came within approximately 30 days after 9/11, so the timing was really, really difficult. And then your chemical agents. Now biological agents are, they come from our environment, viruses, etc., and bacteria. The hardest thing about biological weapons is trying to weaponize them, put them into a state where they can be dispersed as a weapon. It takes great scientific skill to be able to do that. Your chemicals are your manufactured materials, mustard gas, nerve gas, and of course radiological agents, a thing called a dirty bomb, where you take a high explosive and pack it with radiological material and explode it. It's like a small, let's say it's not nuclear, but let's say a small nuclear bomb, but once it explodes, you have the impact of the high explosive, but also you have some radioactive exposure that leaks out into the community, into the air. Next slide. And of course, in the new terrorism that we've already talked about in this class, you have your suicide bombers or human bombs. There's a picture of several of them. The religious motivated suicide bombers, the Lebanon model suicide bombers of U.S. Marines and French garrisons. The Intifada, which is the uprising in the Palestinian territories with suicide bombs. And of course, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, the Islamic State, are known to use suicide bombs along with groups like the Tamil Tigers. Next slide. The new dissidence, the new terrorism, a cell-like structure, and I've just given you a slide that shows how these cells could be. You might have one person there in the center, but these things expand out, and a lot of people have no connection with the others, but they're a group of like-minded people in a very fluid and not always totally linked cell structure. Now there are some links that could be linked to a hub, and maybe the hub only provides the ideological inspiration. It's up to the imagination as to how some of these organizations are established, but that's a picture of what I'm talking about. Of course, the advantage is the operational advantage. If a cell gets caught, they really may not know the identity of any of the other individuals in the organization. Next slide. Our lone wolf terrorist, here's an example of Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. Tried to explode a device on an airplane over the Atlantic. He was a British resident who converted to Islam. He was linked to Al-Qaeda. He was trained in Afghanistan. And he had plastic explosives in his shoes. An alert stewardess and the passengers held him down when they discovered what he was trying to do to get it to go off. And that's the actual shoe that he had. So it would have been a devastating attack had it been successful, because there was almost 200 people on the plane. Next slide.